They found her bound with rope at the crossroads, a lady abandoned by those who should have protected her, left to die like a common criminal in the pre-dawn darkness. The villagers of Millbrook had spoken their judgment with stones and harsh words, casting out Sir Edmund Ashford's widow as surely as they would a plague victim. What they hadn't counted on was Lord Gabriel Blackthorne choosing the old forest road that morning, drawn by restlessness and the need to escape his own ghosts. The mist clung to the ancient oak where they'd tied her, its gnarled branches like twisted fingers reaching toward heaven in supplication. Lady Meredith Ashford hung limp against the ropes, her fine wool kirtle torn and stained with mud, her dark hair matted with blood from a wound at her temple. The stones scattered around the tree's base told their own story of village justice. Gabriel reined in his destrier shadow, the great black warhorse snorting at the scent of blood and fear that lingered in the morning air. For a moment he thought he'd found another victim of brigands, but the quality of her garments and the careful positioning of her bonds spoke of something more deliberate, more cruel. "My lady," he called, dismounting swiftly. His spurs rang against the frozen ground as he approached, one hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. The countryside had grown lawless of late, and mercy could be a dangerous luxury. She didn't respond to his voice, though her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Gabriel drew his dagger, cutting through the hemp ropes with efficient strokes. As the bindings fell away, she collapsed forward into his arms, her body frighteningly light and cold. He could see now the purple bruising around her wrists where the ropes had bitten deep, the split lip that spoke of violence before her abandonment. Yet even unconscious and battered, there was something about her face that caught at his memory. Lady Meredith Ashford, he'd heard the name whispered in recent weeks, always followed by darker words. Witch, murderess, devil's bride. "What did they do to you?" he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. Shadow stamped impatiently, sensing his master's urgency. Gabriel gathered her carefully in his arms, noting how her fingers were blue with cold, despite the wool cloak they'd left her. A mockery of mercy, perhaps, or simply oversight in their haste to be rid of her. Either way, she wouldn't survive another hour exposed to the elements. As he settled her across his saddle, her head lolling against his chest, Gabriel found himself making a choice that would change both their fates. He could have ridden on, left her to whatever justice the villagers thought she deserved. Instead, he turned Shadow toward Blackthorne Manor, carrying an accused witch into his home, and all the dangerous complications that would surely follow. The rope burns on her wrists would heal, but Gabriel suspected the deeper wounds would prove far more treacherous to mend. Blackthorne Manor rose from the moors like a stone fortress against the grey morning sky, its towers and battlements speaking of wealth earned through generations of service to the crown. Gabriel's boots echoed against the cobblestones as he carried Lady Meredith across the courtyard, her unconscious form drawing curious stares from stable boys and servants going about their morning duties. "Master Gabriel," Mrs. Hartwell appeared. At the great hall's entrance, her weathered face creased with concern. The housekeeper had served the Blackthorne family for 30 years, raising Gabriel after his parents' death, and nothing escaped her sharp eyes. "What have you brought us?" "A woman in need of sanctuary," Gabriel replied, not breaking stride as he mounted the stone steps. "Prepare the blue chamber. Send for Brother Thomas immediately." Mrs. Hartwell fell into step beside him, her ring of keys jangling at her waist. "Is she alive but barely? They left her bound at Hangman's Cross like a common criminal." Gabriel's jaw tightened at the memory. "Gather clean linens and warm water, and Agnes, discretion would be wise." The blue chamber had been his mother's favourite, its tall windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Gabriel laid Lady Meredith carefully upon the feather mattress, noting how the fine embroidery on her kirtle marked her as nobility despite her current state. Her skin held the pallor of someone who'd spent hours in the cold, and when he touched her forehead, fever burned beneath his fingers. "Lady Meredith Ashford," Mrs. Hartwell breathed, recognition dawning in her voice. "Lord preserve us, Gabriel. Do you know what they're saying about her in the villages?" "I know what men always say about women they fear," Gabriel replied grimly, beginning to unlace Lady Meredith's muddy boots. "Help me get her warm." As Mrs. Hartwell bustled about preparing hot stones wrapped in wool, Lady Meredith stirred restlessly. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever, and she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "Please," she murmured, her hands clutching at the coverlet. "I didn't. Edmund, tell them I didn't." Her words dissolved into incoherent fragments about herbs and healing, about accusations that made Mrs. Hartwell cross herself. Gabriel sat beside the bed, his large hand covering her smaller one. "You're safe now," he said quietly, though he wasn't certain she could hear him. "Whatever they believe you've done, you're under my protection." Lady Meredith's fever-bright eyes fixed on his face for a moment, and he saw not the evil witch of village gossip, but a terrified woman who'd survived something unspeakable. Her lips moved again, forming words that chilled him. "They'll come for me," she whispered. "They always come for women like me." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the moors, and Gabriel found himself wondering what forces he'd set in motion by choosing mercy over caution. Lady Meredith woke to sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows and the unfamiliar comfort of clean linens against her skin. For a moment, she thought herself back in her marriage bed at Ashford Hall, until memory crashed over her like cold water. The ropes, the stones, the hatred in their eyes as they dragged her from her home. She sat up too quickly, gasping as her bruised ribs protested. The chamber was richly appointed with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, far grander than anything she'd known even as Sir Edmund's wife. A man rose from a chair beside the window, tall, dark-haired, with the bearing of nobility and eyes that held unexpected gentleness. "Easy, my lady," Lord Gabriel said, moving closer but keeping a respectful distance. "You're safe here. This is Blackthorn Manor. I remember," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming pleas that had fallen on deaf ears. "You found me at the crossroads. Why did you—" She touched her throat, where rope burns still marked her skin. "Why didn't you leave me?" Mrs. Hartwell entered with a tray of bread and warm ale, her motherly face kind but cautious. "Because his lordship has a conscience, child. Drink this. You need your strength." Meredith accepted the cup with trembling hands, studying Gabriel's face over the rim. "Do you know what they say I am? What they accused me of?" "I know what men call women who threaten them," Gabriel replied, settling into his chair again. "Tell me what truly happened." The words came slowly at first, like water through a cracked dam, then faster as the story poured out. How she'd learned healing from her mother, using herbs to help the village women through difficult births and fevers. How Sir Edmund had encouraged her knowledge, even defended her when Father Benedict first began his whispered accusations. "When the fever took Edmund last winter," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "I tried everything to save him. But Father Benedict said it was God's will, that my interference was—" She swallowed hard. "Witchcraft." Gabriel's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "And after your husband died, the accusations grew bolder. Women I'd helped turned against me, afraid of being associated with a witch. Father Benedict preached that Edmund's death was divine punishment for my sins." Tears tracked down her cheeks. "When the blacksmith's son died of lung fever despite my herbs, they said I'd cursed him. That's when they came for me." Mrs. Hartwell made a sound of disgust. "Father Benedict always was an ambitious snake. Uses fear to control his flock. You know him?" Meredith asked, surprised. Gabriel nodded grimly. Benedict seeks a bishopric. Burning a witch would certainly advance his cause with the church hierarchy. The implications settled over them like a funeral shroud. This wasn't merely a village superstition. It was calculated ambition dressed in religious fervor. "He won't stop," Meredith said quietly. "He'll come for me here. Claim you're harboring evil." Gabriel's smile held no warmth. "Then Father Benedict will discover that some evils have teeth." Father Benedict knelt before the altar of St. Bartholomew's Church, his pale hands clasped in prayer that had nothing to do with divine communion and everything to do with earthly ambition. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across his angular face as he calculated his next move against the witch who'd escaped his righteous judgment. "Father," Thomas Miller, the village reeve, cleared his throat from the church entrance. "The men are gathered as you requested." Benedict rose with deliberate ceremony, his black robes rustling against the stone floor. In the nave, a dozen village elders waited with the restless energy of hounds held on too tight a leash. These were the same men who'd helped drag Lady Meredith from her cottage 3 nights past, their righteousness fueled by Benedict's sermons and their own fears. "Brothers in Christ," Benedict began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of years in the pulpit, "the devil's servant has found sanctuary with Lord Blackthorn. We cannot allow this corruption to spread." William the blacksmith, whose son's death had provided the final accusation against Lady Meredith, stepped forward. "What would you have us do, Father? Lord Blackthorn's not some village yeoman we can pressure into compliance." A cold smile played at Benedict's lips. "Even lords must answer to the church, and to the crown." He gestured to a travel-stained messenger who'd arrived that morning. "Brother Marcus brings word from the bishop's seat. His Grace is interested in reports of witchcraft in our region." The messenger, a thin man with nervous eyes, produced a sealed parchment. "His lordship is commanded to present the accused for proper ecclesiastical examination. Failure to comply." He swallowed hard. "Well, harboring a witch is itself a grave sin." Thomas Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Lord Blackthorn's family has served the crown for generations. His father died in the King's Wars. Surely," Benedict interrupted, his voice sharp as winter steel. "Past service doesn't grant license for present heresy. The woman must be surrendered for trial, or Lord Blackthorn himself may face questions about his faith." The threat hung in the church air like incense smoke. Every man present understood the implications. Accusations of witchcraft could destroy even noble houses, especially when backed by church authority. "I'll ride to Blackthorn Manor," the messenger said reluctantly. "Deliver the bishop's demand personally." Benedict's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Tell his lordship that the church's patience is not infinite. The witch will face judgment, whether he cooperates willingly or—" He let the words trail off meaningfully. As the men filed out into the grey morning, Benedict remained behind, studying the crucifix above the altar. Lady Meredith Ashford would burn for her sins, and her death would pave his path to a bishopric. If Lord Blackthorn chose to protect her, he'd simply provide more fuel for the flames. The messenger mounted his horse with obvious reluctance, carrying words that would shatter the fragile peace of Blackthorn Manor. Lady Meredith walked slowly through the manor's herb garden, her fingers trailing over the rosemary and thyme that grew wild despite the approaching winter. 3 days of rest had returned colour to her cheeks and steadiness to her step, though Gabriel noticed she still favoured her left side, where the ropes had bitten deepest. "These would help with Brother Thomas's cough," she said, crushing mint leaves to release their fragrance, mixed with honey and elderflower. Gabriel watched her from the garden's entrance, struck by how naturally she moved among the plants. There was something almost sacred in the way she touched each herb, as if greeting old friends. "You truly are a healer, aren't you?" She glanced up, wariness flickering across her features. "Does that frighten you, my lord, knowing what I am? It makes me wonder what kind of fools would destroy such a gift." He stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of lavender that clung to her dark hair. "Knowledge of healing is hardly the devil's work." A blush touched her cheeks as she looked away, but not before he saw something unexpected in her eyes. Awareness of him as a man, not merely her protector. The realization sent warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the pale winter sun, my lord. Mrs. Hartwell's voice interrupted from the garden gate. "A messenger's arrived from Millbrook. He waits in your study." Gabriel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "We'll continue this later, my lady. Perhaps you'd join me in the library afterward. I have some texts on herbal remedies that might interest you." The messenger's demands echoed in Gabriel's mind as he later found Meredith surrounded by leather-bound volumes in his library. She sat curled in a chair too large for her, reading by candlelight, looking more like a scholar than the dangerous. "Which Father Benedict claimed her to be? Find anything useful?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "More than I expected." Her voice held a tremor that made him lean forward. "Gabriel, these records, they speak of other women, other accusations of witchcraft in surrounding villages, all in the past 5 years." She handed him a chronicle written by a traveling monk. His blood chilled as he read accounts of healers and midwives burned for their knowledge, always with Father Benedict's influence lurking in the margins. "Dear God," he breathed, "how many?" "7 that I can find, all women who threatened the established order somehow." Her hand shook as she touched another page. "All condemned by priests seeking advancement through righteous zeal." Gabriel set down the book, his hands clenching into fists. "This isn't about faith, it's about power." "And I'm his path to a bishopric," Meredith whispered. "My death will prove his devotion to rooting out evil." Their eyes met across the candlelit space, and Gabriel saw his own growing feelings reflected in her gaze, tenderness shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow might tear them apart forever. The great hall of Blackthorn Manor had witnessed generations of political negotiations, but none quite as dangerous as the confrontation unfolding beneath its vaulted ceiling. Lord Harwick sat at the head table, his weathered face impassive as he reviewed the bishop's writ, while Father Benedict stood nearby with the righteous bearing of a man certain of divine favor. Gabriel entered with Meredith at his side, her chin raised despite the tremor in her hands. She wore one of his mother's gowns, deep blue wool, that transformed her from accused witch to noble lady, though he doubted it would sway men already convinced of her guilt. "Lord Blackthorn," Harwick began without preamble, "you stand accused of harboring a known heretic in defiance of church authority. What say you to these charges?" "I say that Lady Meredith Ashford is under my protection as a guest in my house," Gabriel replied evenly. "I've seen no evidence of heresy, only a woman, skilled in healing, who's been condemned by village superstition." Father Benedict stepped forward, his pale eyes glittering. "My lord speaks from ignorance. This woman practiced dark arts, consorted with demons to curse Christian souls. The evidence, Gabriel interrupted, his voice carrying. "The authority of generations of noble blood consists of frightened villagers seeking someone to blame for natural deaths. Where I see a healer, you see a witch. Perhaps the difference lies in what each of us wishes to find." Harwick's expression remained neutral, but Gabriel caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "The Church has jurisdiction in matters of heresy, regardless of personal opinion. The woman must be surrendered for proper trial." Gabriel felt Meredith tense beside him, heard her sharp intake of breath. In that moment, he made a choice that would bind their fates together irrevocably. "I'm afraid that's impossible, my lord." Gabriel said, reaching for Meredith's hand and clasping it firmly in his own. "Lady Meredith is my betrothed. Any accusations against her must be brought before me as her future husband and protector." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Benedict's face flushed with rage, while Harwick leaned back in his chair, studying them with new interest. Meredith's hand trembled in Gabriel's, but she didn't pull away. "You're betrothed?" Harwick asked softly. "When was this arrangement made?" "Before her late husband's death," Gabriel lied smoothly. "Sir Edmund approached me last winter, seeking a suitable match for his widow should anything befall him. The contract was informal, but witnessed." Father Benedict sputtered protests about demonic seduction and unholy unions, but Harwick raised a hand for silence. "Interesting. And you're prepared to stake your honor on her innocence?" Gabriel squeezed Meredith's hand, feeling her strength flow back into him. "I stake my life on it." The words hung in the air like a sword over both their heads, binding them together in defiance of church and crown alike. The village graveyard lay shrouded in morning mist, its weathered stones marking lives ended too soon. Meredith walked carefully between the graves, her borrowed cloak pulled tight against the chill as she searched for the markers Mrs. Hartwell had described. Gabriel followed close behind, his hand resting on his sword hilt as they ventured into territory that felt increasingly hostile. "There," Mrs. Hartwell whispered, pointing to a cluster of simple wooden crosses at the graveyard's edge. "The unmarked graves. They bury the condemned here, away from consecrated ground. 7 crosses, just as the Chronicle had recorded. 7 women whose only crime had been possessing knowledge that threatened men like Father Benedict." Meredith knelt beside the first marker, running her fingers over the crude carving that bore no name, only a date from 3 years past. "Agnes Miller," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, "midwife. Helped birth half the village children before they accused her of cursing difficult labors." Gabriel crouched beside another cross. "This one's fresher, 6 months old. Mary Fletcher, herb, woman like yourself, my lady. Father Benedict said she made pacts with demons to heal the sick." Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried bitter anger. "She saved my grandson from fever, and they burned her for it." Meredith's hands clenched into fists as she moved from grave to grave, each cross representing a life destroyed by ambition masked as righteousness. "We need proof," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "Something, more than village gossip. There's talk of records," Mrs. Hartwell offered hesitantly. "There's talk of records," Mrs. Hartwell offered hesitantly. "Father Benedict keeps detailed accounts of his investigations, claims it's for church archives." Gabriel stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Where would he keep such documents?" "The old cottage behind the church, Mary Fletcher's place. He's been using it as a private study since her execution." They found the cottage exactly as Mrs. Hartwell had described, its windows shuttered and door barred with an iron lock. Gabriel made quick work of the latch with his dagger, and they slipped inside the musty interior. Shelves lined the walls, filled with confiscated belongings of the condemned women. Herb pouches, healing oils, books of remedies written in careful feminine hands. "Dear God," Meredith breathed, touching a familiar mortar and pestle. "These were their tools, their knowledge. He's kept everything like trophies." Gabriel discovered a wooden chest beneath a shrouded table. Inside lay scrolls covered in Father Benedict's meticulous script, detailed accounts of each woman's crimes, descriptions of evidence fabricated or twisted to support accusations of witchcraft. But most damning were the letters to church officials, each execution carefully presented as proof of Benedict's zealous devotion to rooting out heresy. "It's all here," Gabriel said grimly, holding up a letter bearing the bishop's seal. His correspondence, his plans for advancement, even payments received for surrendering property of the condemned to the church. Meredith stared at the evidence, of systematic murder, feeling the weight of 7 dead women's stories in her hands. "This isn't just about me anymore," she whispered. "It's about all of them, about making sure no other woman dies for his ambition." Gabriel met her eyes, seeing the transformation from frightened victim to determined avenger. "Then we make him answer for every death." The chapel at Blackthorn Manor had witnessed 3 generations of family ceremonies, but none conducted under such desperate circumstances. Candles flickered in the morning light as Brother Thomas, the manor's elderly chaplain, prepared the altar for a betrothal that might save a life or damn 2 souls. Meredith stood before the stone crucifix, wearing his mother's finest gown, deep emerald wool that brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Gabriel had chosen his father's ceremonial doublet, the rich burgundy velvet lending gravity to what should have been a joyous occasion. Instead, the weight of their deception pressed down like storm clouds. "Are you certain about this path?" Brother Thomas asked quietly as he arranged the ceremonial cup and bread. "A false betrothal before God carries its own spiritual dangers." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Nothing false about my intentions, brother. The timing may be forced, but my commitment is real." Magistrate Aldrich arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his weathered face skeptical as he took his place as witness. Behind him came Mrs. Hartwell and several trusted household servants, their presence lending legitimacy to proceedings that felt more like a military strategy than a celebration. "We gather to witness the formal betrothal of Lord Gabriel Blackthorn and Lady Meredith Ashford," Brother Thomas began, his voice carrying despite its tremor. "Let any who would speak against this union do so now, or forever hold their peace." The chapel doors burst open with a crash that echoed off the stone walls. Father Benedict strode inside, flanked by armed men bearing the bishop's colors, his pale eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I speak against this unholy union," Benedict declared, his voice cutting through the sacred space like a blade. "This woman has bewitched Lord Blackthorn, clouded his judgment with demonic arts." Gabriel stepped protectively in front of Meredith, his hand moving to his sword. "You overstep your bounds, priest. This is my chapel, my ceremony." "A ceremony that cannot proceed," Benedict replied, producing a scroll bearing official seals. "I bring word from the bishop himself. Lord Blackthorn stands accused of harboring a known heretic, of allowing her corruption to spread within his household." Magistrate Aldrich examined the document, his expression growing grave. "These are serious charges, my lord. The bishop demands investigation into your entire household's spiritual welfare." Meredith felt the walls closing around them, each official seal another bar in their cage. But when Gabriel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers before God and witnesses, she felt strength flow between them like molten steel. "Then let them investigate," Gabriel declared, his voice ringing with defiant nobility. "They'll find nothing but a man protecting the woman he loves from false accusations born of ambition and fear." Father Benedict's smile was cold as winter. "Stone, we shall see what investigation reveals, my lord. We shall see indeed." The betrothal cup remained untouched on the altar, their union blessed by intention but unconsummated by ceremony, hanging in limbo like their very lives. The village square had been transformed into an arena of judgment, wooden platforms hastily erected to accommodate the magistrate's tribunal and the crowd that pressed in from every side. Meredith stood in the center of the space, her hands bound not with rope this time, but with iron shackles that marked her as accused. Gabriel stood with Lord Harwick among the nobility, his face a mask of controlled fury as he watched the proceedings. He was powerless to stop. "Lady Meredith Ashford," Magistrate Aldrich announced, his voice carrying across the square, "you stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of communing with dark forces, and of corrupting the faithful through demonic arts. How do you answer these charges?" Meredith lifted her chin, drawing strength from the memory of 7 unmarked graves. I answer that I am a healer, trained in the use of God's own herbs to ease suffering. If that is witchcraft, then Christ himself was a sorcerer for healing the sick. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others scandalized by her boldness. Father Benedict rose from his seat beside the magistrate, his black robes billowing like vulture wings. "Blasphemy," he declared. "She compounds her sins by comparing her devilry to our Lord's miracles. But we have witnesses to her crimes." One by one, villagers came forward with testimony carefully coached and shaped by Benedict's influence. The blacksmith spoke of his son's death after Meredith's failed treatment. A farmer's wife claimed her milk had soured after refusing Meredith's services. Each accusation built upon the last, painting a picture of supernatural malevolence that made the crowd grow restless. But when Thomas Miller stepped forward as the final witness, something unexpected happened. "I've watched this woman for 3 years," he began, his weathered hands trembling, "seen her heal my grandson's fever, help my daughter through a difficult birth. If she's a witch, then she's one who serves God's mercy, not the devil's malice." "Father," Benedict's face flushed with rage, "you speak from ignorance, Thomas. The devil often disguises—" "No," Thomas interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "I speak from watching you, Father, watching how every woman who threatened your authority somehow became a witch, how their property always ended up in church hands after their deaths." Gabriel seized the moment, stepping forward despite Lord Harwick's restraining hand. "My lords, I submit evidence of Father Benedict's true crimes." He produced the scrolls they'd found in Mary Fletcher's cottage, the damning correspondence that revealed years of calculated murder. The crowd pressed closer as Magistrate Aldrich examined the documents, his face growing pale. Father Benedict lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers, but Gabriel's sword was faster, its point coming to rest at the priest's throat. "Careful, Father," Gabriel said softly. "Wouldn't want anyone to think you had something to hide." The square erupted in chaos as the truth began to dawn on villagers who'd watched their neighbors burn for one man's ambition. Father Benedict's private chambers reeked of desperation and incense as Magistrate Aldrich's men searched through years of carefully hidden evidence. The priest sat shackled in his own chair, his pale face a mask of crumbling authority as document after document revealed the scope of his crimes. Outside, the village square buzzed with voices raised in anger and disbelief. 23 pieces of silver, Mrs. Hartwell announced, reading from a ledger she'd discovered behind a loose stone. Payment received for Agnes Miller's cottage after her execution. 30 for Mary Fletcher's herb garden. Her voice grew stronger with each entry. Blood money, every coin of it. Gabriel stood by the window, watching the crowd below grow larger as word spread. Meredith remained at his side, no longer the accused, but a witness to justice finally emerging from shadows. The iron shackles had been removed from her wrists, transferred instead to the man who'd orchestrated 7 murders in God's name. "The correspondence with Bishop Aldwin is particularly damning," Magistrate Aldrich observed, holding up a scroll bearing elaborate seals. "Each execution reported as proof of your zealous devotion. Each woman's death another step toward your advancement." Benedict finally spoke, his voice a whisper of its former commanding power. "They were witches, all of them. I saved this village from corruption. You murdered innocent women for profit." Gabriel interrupted, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Used their knowledge against them, turned their healing gifts into evidence of heresy." Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, her weathered face hard as granite. "I watched you counsel husbands to report their wives' healing practices. Saw you plant evidence of devil worship in Mary Fletcher's cottage before the search." She pulled a small cloth bag from her apron. "These bones you claimed came from her rituals." "The chicken bones from your own kitchen." The revelation hit Benedict like a physical blow. His careful facade cracked completely, revealing the desperate ambition beneath. "You don't understand," he snarled, lurching to his feet despite his bonds. "I was so close. The bishopric was within reach. All I needed was one more—" He broke off, lunging toward a concealed dagger in his desk drawer. Gabriel's blade was faster, catching the priest's wrist before the weapon could clear its hiding place. Benedict screamed in pain and rage, the sound echoing through the chamber like a damned soul's final cry. "Enough!" Magistrate Aldrich commanded. "Father Benedict, by the authority of church and crown, I arrest you for murder, theft, and corruption of holy office." As the guards dragged Benedict away, he turned back once, his eyes burning with malevolent hatred. "This isn't finished," he hissed at Meredith. "Others will come. They always do." But his words carried no weight now, empty threats from a broken man whose empire of fear had finally crumbled. In the square below, villagers began the long process of reckoning with the innocent blood spilled in their name. Spring had transformed the village of Millbrook into something it had never been before, a place where healing flourished without fear. Meredith walked through the marketplace, her basket filled with herbs and remedies freely given to those who'd once called for her death. The change hadn't come easily, but like tender shoots pushing through winter-hardened earth, trust had begun to take root. "Lady Meredith," called Sarah, the baker's wife, hurrying forward with her young daughter in tow. "Little Emma's cough has worsened in the night. Might you have something to ease her breathing?" Meredith knelt to examine the child, noting the flush of fever and the telltale wheeze that spoke of lung congestion. 6 months ago, these same people had thrown stones at her. Now they sought her knowledge as the gift it had always been. "Honey mixed with elderflower tea," she advised, pressing a small vial into Sarah's grateful hands. 3 times daily until the fever breaks, and keep her warm. Spring air can be treacherous for little lungs." The transformation extended beyond individual healings. Where Father Benedict's church had once stood empty, except for fear-driven attendants, a new priest, Brother Francis, led services focused on mercy rather than condemnation. The 7 unmarked graves now bore proper headstones, their names restored to memory and honor. Gabriel found her in the afternoon, sitting beside Mary Fletcher's restored grave, where wildflowers had been planted in remembrance. "The chapel is ready," he said softly, offering his hand to help her rise. "Brother Thomas has prepared everything for the ceremony." This time there would be no political maneuvering or desperate gambits. This wedding came from choice, not necessity, blessed by a community that had learned the difference between faith and fear. The manor chapel glowed with candlelight and spring blossoms as villagers filled the pews, not as suspicious witnesses, but as celebrants of a union that had helped heal their wounded souls. Mrs. Hartwell sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched the young woman she'd helped nurse back to life take her place beside the altar. "Do you, Gabriel, take this woman as your wife?" Brother Thomas asked. "To love and cherish, to protect and honor, for all the days of your life?" "I do," Gabriel replied, his voice carrying the weight of promises already proven through trial and danger. "And do you, Meredith, take this man as your husband, to love and cherish, to stand beside in all seasons of joy and sorrow?" Meredith looked into Gabriel's eyes, seeing not just the Lord who'd saved her life, but the partner who'd helped her reclaim her purpose. "I do." As their lips met in the kiss that sealed their union, the church bells rang out across the countryside, proclaiming that love and justice had triumphed over fear and corruption. Outside, the spring evening promised new growth, new possibilities, and the lasting peace that came from building on foundations of truth. The herb garden at Blackthorn Manor had grown beyond anything Meredith could have imagined when she'd first touched those winter-withered plants a year ago. Now, rows of healing. Herbs stretched toward the horizon, tended by women from 3 villages who came to learn the arts that had once been cause for condemnation. She walked slowly between the lavender and rosemary, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where new life grew like hope made manifest. "The delegation from Winchester has arrived," Gabriel announced, joining her in the garden's peaceful embrace. His eyes held the same wonder they'd shown on their wedding day, now deepened by the knowledge that their child would be born into a world they'd helped reshape. Through the manor's windows, Meredith could see the visiting lords and church, officials gathering in the great hall, drawn by reports of a village that had transformed fear into flourishing. What had begun as her personal survival had become something larger, a testament to what communities could achieve when truth replaced superstition. "Bishop Edmund wishes to document our methods," Gabriel continued, his arms circling her waist, with practiced tenderness. "He speaks of establishing healing centers in other regions, places where women's knowledge can be preserved rather than persecuted." Meredith smiled, remembering the terror she'd felt at the crossroads where Gabriel had found her. That frightened woman seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who'd discovered strength not just in survival, but in service to others. Mrs. Hartwell appeared from the kitchen garden, her apron dusted with flour and her face bright with satisfaction. "Lord Bishop's asking for you specifically, my lady. Wants to hear about the Women's Council you've established?" The Women's Council, Meredith's proudest achievement. Former accusers and accused now worked together, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of mothers and grandmothers. What Father Benedict had tried to destroy, they had rebuilt stronger than before. "In a moment," Meredith replied, watching a group of village children play near the memorial stones that now honored the 7 women whose deaths had paved the path to justice. Their laughter carried on the spring breeze, proof that innocence could survive even the darkest times. Gabriel's hand covered hers on her belly, and she felt their child stir as if responding to his touch. This baby would grow up knowing the full story, the darkness that had once ruled these lands, and the courage that had driven it away. But more importantly, the child would inherit a world where healing was celebrated, not feared. "Ready?" Gabriel asked softly. Meredith took one last look at the thriving garden, at the village beyond, where smoke rose peacefully from cottage chimneys, at the future they'd planted with their own hands. "Ready," she said, and together they walked toward the manor where dignitaries waited to learn how love and justice could bloom even in the harshest soil. The crossroads where she'd nearly died now marked the beginning of roads that led to hope.